Please welcome back to the stage our host, A&A Group Executive Vice President, Bill Tucker.
Welcome back, and thanks again, Experian, for our coffee break. A&A has been actively addressing the lack of transparency in the programmatic space for some time, as well as the associated ad tax, which is costing marketers billions of dollars a year. Our next session starts with a moderated one-on-one discussion, followed by a panel with a pioneer in the programmatic industry who is leading a consortium of key partners who will join him as they seek to fix the transparency issues in the digital media supply chain. Please welcome to the stage the founder and chief executive officer of MediaMath, Joe Zawadzki, and senior technology analyst at Forrester, Joanna O'Connell.
Wow, I like these chairs.
Let's see.
This is like real fireside chat style chairs.
Yeah, that's good.
So thanks everybody for joining us. Joe, excited to have this conversation with you. You know that I'm passionate about an advertising ecosystem that is healthy and thrives, right? And we're living in a really interesting time in advertising. It feels like a bit of a crossroads. Mm-hmm. We have sort of very real data deprecation issues coming from regulation, very fair privacy concerns, and then, of course, the browsers, and most recently Google with Chrome, deprecating the cookie, so the cookie is ostensibly is going to die, which has, a major impact on how advertising can and maybe should work, right? When we're thinking about the needs of the marketer, your customer, the publisher, right, who essentially survives on ad revenue, largely, to create content, and really importantly, I haven't talked about this enough, I think, as an industry, the consumer, right, who's sort of on the receiving end of all this stuff and has started saying, hey, I'm actually not totally cool with how things are working, and they're starting to find ways to get away from it, and that's not good for anybody. So I think we're going to have a little bit of a probably philosophical and also nerdy technical conversation.
Let's hope.
Right? Over the next few minutes. Are people cool with nerdy technical? All right. But I thought it seemed important to start with the philosophical conversation first, so that we're all grounded in sort of why conversations like this one are so incredibly important for the advertising industry and for marketers like you, by the way, who are trying to develop these relationships with consumers and are living in this world. So can you maybe just talk a little bit about what's going on, what got us to this place, and sort of what you're thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised that we're, folks are reading the same tea leaves and, breathing the same air, and it felt like there was a creeping dissatisfaction from, everybody that was sort of involved in the value chain, right? So you had, marketers, and we, IBM who'll be here, and you've got Mark Pritchard up on stage, and you've got, State Farms and Ubers and whatnot, and very consistently as a class, it was like this, the promises of this connection to a consumer in a real-time way, we get it. It's more important than ever. It's not working, in the way that it should. And then you have the same votes from consumers, similarly in terms of, regulation, in terms of PR, in terms of ad blocking, and watching and behavior. And then to your point about publishers, literally starving, right? High-quality journalism, struggling to figure out how to make it work. So we kind of heard the call, I suppose, and 2 years ago now, we kind of said, okay, the only way to get through this is effectively to redesign the connective tissue between a brand and a consumer, and not to obviously continue to pursue this evolution, but to really think around, if you were to start over, knowing what you know, if you were to kind of redesign the terms of trade, if you were to require different technical connections amongst the key parts of that value chain, where you had alignment around what was really important, that people recognized that everyone was in it together, you could agree on principles around accountability and things around fraud, things around discrepancies, things around how the marketplace works, and then you could agree on definitions around addressability that didn't just adhere to, but in fact, went ahead of where regulation was, in order to make consumers really, believe in sort of this value exchange and sort of this promise. If you could find the subset of companies that had the engineering resources, that had the willingness to reinvent their own businesses and their business models, And you could put them together, and then you could actually show, as opposed to tell, that this was possible. You could make one, huge leap forward in terms of what everybody now is saying. Oh my gosh, we have a 2-year shot clock, and that was the sort of the genesis behind this effort.
So I mean, in very specific and practical terms, we're talking about the digital advertising supply chain.
We are.
Let's just be super clear, because I know it's a thing that the ANA has been thinking about and talking about and championing, which is wonderful. And I think for a little while, but as both of us I think are saying, we are living in an era now where there is urgency that we absolutely cannot ignore, right? How do we make an industry that works? And when we talk about the supply chain, it has grown up in a way over the last certainly 10 to 12 years in programmatic advertising. Says a person who co-founded a trading desk, so I know of which I speak here. It's messy and complicated and opaque, and maybe to the point that you're making and that we're going to talk about today, not really designed in a way that is as effective as it could be for all of the parties who matter. Again, the publishers, the brands, and the consumers.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Yeah. And like anything else, it's really hard to affect change across thousands of companies all making local decisions.
Absolutely.
So this idea of getting a reference set of key players, and again, they're up on the stage, shortly, and I'm excited to bring them out.
Yeah.
And then literally, you just have to build it. You've got to show people that it's possible, and it's not just here's what everybody else needs to do, but here's what this group can actually do,
And this is what it needs to look like.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
All right. Well, lots more to talk about. So let's bring them out. We have Rich from IBM. We have Jerry from. Does it say Merkle? It says Mercury, the new name, and David Cole from TrustX. Can you guys come on out and join us? Hi, guys. Come
Hello.
on down.
Please.
Oh, sure. Apparently you can't hear me, which seems impossible because I'm super loud. Guys, thanks so much for joining. Let's hop into this. I'm sure you heard what Joe and I were talking about, and I'm sure it's a thing you're thinking lots about. So let's continue the conversation, but expand it a little bit, because we have someone who is in a role as marketer. We have someone who is in a role of sort of supporting technology and sort of data, and we have someone who is looking after and thinking about the needs of the kind of premium publisher community, yes? So this sort of is representative of many of the key parts here of this digital advertising supply chain. Appropriately, I think we should start with the marketer. Right? You're the guy who is trying to reach those consumers. You are the guy who holds the dollars and who is responsible for sort of creating value from those dollars. So can you talk a little bit, Rich, about what it was that you were sort of struggling with? Like, what was the angst you were feeling about the way advertising was working that sort of prompted you to want to see change?
It comes to a question of what was working, right? The system would work reasonably well, but we were constantly finding ourselves fighting to find the right consumer at the right time with the right creative, and do it in a way that was going to allow us to continue to drive the yield out of our investment.
Yep.
And there's a lot of technology, there's a lot of tools, there's a lot of people selling you all sorts of things on a day-to-day basis. But as we started digging into it and really kind of looking at it from a basic supply chain management perspective, right? We started looking at where the value was being added, where things were not adding value, where there were duplicate costs in the system, and how do we get those costs out of the system? And how do we drive up the yield from every dollar we're putting into the system?
Yep.
Without necessarily going in, like some of my colleagues have done over the years, and really trying to beat up the publisher for better prices.
Right.
Because it's not about the publisher. The publisher's, as you said, trying to survive, trying to make good quality content and really make a living off of it. And there were a lot of other people, however, in the chain who were not really adding a lot of value in the cycle.
Yeah.
So how do we get them out?
Well, you know what's interesting? I've had lots of conversations with brands over the last couple of years about this question of sort of supply chain transparency and supply chain management. It is onerous and difficult and takes a lot of time and energy to try and suss that stuff out, yes? I mean, it becomes a
very
full-time
much
job.
so. There's a lot of the stuff that's very visible. You see it, you know what it is, and you can go and attack it through normal supply chain procurement sort of processes. But in the programmatic universe, there's so much of it that's hidden behind the covers that you can't actually see.
Yeah.
And in that case, it's very difficult to figure out where to attack and how to attack and how to do it smartly, because again, you're not trying to just beat people out of a living, you're trying to drive effectiveness into what you do.
Yep. Yep. And we're talking about a lot of dollars here. I mean, we're talking about material amounts of money that are flowing through these pipes, right? I mean,
Oh, yeah.
when programmatic was a baby, it was maybe okay to create a supply chain that was sort of subpar. It's not anymore. It's, you know, we're living in a different era, billions of dollars. It is existential. So, David, maybe we'll turn to you. Talk a little bit about, you are essentially representing a set of premium publishers and their needs. You know, what are they struggling with? Why is this important to them?
I think Rich nailed it. For the marketer, the goal has to be getting the highest possible percentage of media investment through to places where that media can turn into advertising that consumers can see. Yep. And for the publisher in programmatic, the gap between dollars from all of you and your agencies to the publisher was too great. There were too many steps in the process and a lot of non-transparent things happening. I know I'll give a compliment to Bob Leodice, who many, many years ago said one of my favorite ever quotes, which is, where there's mystery, there's margin.
That's
and
good.
We created a lot of mystery.
Yeah.
We launched TrustX, it's been about 3.5 years ago, with 30 of the world's top quality professional news, sports, and entertainment publishers. So we represent publishers. We execute as a supply-side media exchange. And when we launched the business, we had a very clear mission, which was to restore the trust, the transparency, the accountability, and the safety that brands like Rich and IBM and everyone else really deserve with the value that automation can bring to the supply chain. So the publishers were very behind this because their goal was to create a better experience for the buyer, to get more of the media dollars through, and of course that means more revenue to them. And our goal as a technology company was to minimize the mystery. And so Source, by the way, what we're here talking about is, it completes the picture. As a supply-side platform, there's only so much we can do alone. When you integrate, Joe said it earlier on stage, when the pipes are connected, when the data flows in both directions, when there's clarity for the advertiser as to the tools they can use to get their media in front of the right people at the right time, it makes it a lot easier for everyone in this room and your agencies to actually execute with the benefit of the automation, but without some of the complexity that Rich just talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I think words like urgency and existential are important to remember as we're having this conversation. Okay, so turning the conversation slightly, the cookie is all but dead. You know, we have a 2-year time clock from Chrome. It's already sort of died in other browsers, and we are having conversations as an industry about kind of what comes next, right? What do we do in a world where we don't have cookies, which, by the way, really are kind of the mechanism of communication, or they traditionally have been, for the digital advertising ecosystem, right? Like, for better or worse, that's how systems talk to each other. And the conversation has turned to one of identity, right? And how do we create a new backbone for communication, for transaction, to be able to facilitate the kind of stuff that brands want to do, and that's going to allow publishers to really reap the most reward from the great content that they create and the relationships with the consumers that they have, right? And the exhaust that comes out of that. So, but I will tell you in total truthfulness, inside of Forrester, it's quite a fraught conversation, this notion of, should this thing be built on the backbone of identity? That freaks some people out. So can we talk a little bit about what we mean in this context when we're talking about identity?
Yeah, so, well, first, maybe the K gave it away, but Mercury is Merkle's identity resolution and data platform business, and what we're enabling for clients, and related to Joanna's point, is we're enabling ownership, transparency, and control of many different organizations' private identity graph. And very important here is, we've believed at Merkle for many, many years that there's two sides. There's the enterprise marketer, but you have to add sales and service as well, where The way that those marketers that are also interested in enterprise identity work with us is they license our master person ID. That master person ID is PII based. We append third-party data that's PII sourced to that. And that becomes what all audiences are created based on. So direct mail and email campaigns, the database has fresh data and they can understand that this is in fact a consumer. But then there's the connectivity. And as Joanna said, the house that digital has been built on has been the third-party cookie. With that going away, you have to think of the 3 levels of identity that publishers and media owners have. Right? So if you think of it as sort of best to a level of, okay, I have that, but it's not great, is number 1, it's logins. So if you think of publishers like a Pandora or platforms like a Pandora, to get that experience, you have to log in. So we're helping publishers, and I think you'll see this in the next 2 to 3 years happen. They're going to move more content to behind a login, right? Now, what happens though with that second level? You'd be surprised, there's outbound email campaigns and there's newsletter signups that happen across many publishers and media owners. So that's a strong ID, that's usually an email address. So we resolve that to a Mercury master. But then there's the non-logged in. And on the non-logged in—
Which is a lot still.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot. Now, on the non-logged in though, it's absolutely about first party IDs as well. So for us, how we're doing this is we acquired a company called Foresight. It's bolstered our first-party cookie technology, and all that non-logged in traffic that occurs is resolved to a Mercury ID. Now, does it have somebody who's logged in yet? No. But when you look at that massive scale across a publisher, the logged in and the outbound emails that we're helping them to send, the collection of first-party data like an email address at an event becomes their seed. And then now we can look at page context, we can look at the total universe of the non-logged in, and we can model to that. And it all resolves back to a person ID. Now the integration with source, which is very important, is that ID when somebody shows up on page is a clean audience. It's not duplicate cookies, right? Clients know what they're getting. So the intended audience that the ad will serve to is a list of people. And what that gives you is a level of true reach and frequency, accountability than when those campaigns are run. So when that bid happens, you're bidding on that Mercury person ID, you get that report that it's true reach and frequency, and you're trimming a lot of waste off of the buy. And then imagine also with transparency of that graph that a publisher can offer an email-to-email match, the highest confidence level ID on a page. What would that be worth, right? So there's a level of, I'd bid more to know that this is in fact Joanna O'Connell. And I know that based on a person ID and there's not a cookie, a third-party cookie in the mix there, which is very fuzzy.
Okay.
Right? So that's essentially how we're enabling private graphs on both sides. And we believe person identity, you have to have a person ID, it has to be built off of first-party data, and we're an enabler.
So I want to hang on one second, because you said list of people, and that sounds really darn creepy. And so I know you didn't mean it that way, but I think we should talk for a second about the consumer in all of this. Like, how does a consumer participate in this new, identity-driven world? How does the consumer understand what's happening? How does the consumer have choice and control? And I'm gonna stick with you for a second, and then I want to talk kind of technically about what reinventing the supply chain looks like, so we'll get there next. But can you just for a second, because it's really, really, really important.
Yes. So publishers that we're enabling are we're not enabling them through a third party, right? So it's a publisher coming to us saying, third party cookies dying, what is my basis of identity gonna be? So obviously, CCPA compliant Merkle has been since it started a couple of months ago, and then GDPR compliant. But if somebody opts out and says, do not sell my data, then that absolutely is going to be removed from the master record that the publisher has. So if they have an email on an individual, right, it's gonna be removed, and do not sell happens. And if somebody then wants to opt out of Merkle's data, the third-party data that we source, just like an Axiom or Experience sources PII-based third-party data, that can happen as well. So every single day, consumers can go to the Merkle site and say, I do not want to be in the compiled data set that Merkle has.
Although the funny thing is, I'm not
So-
sure consumers are thinking about Merkle, but
They don't.
they might be thinking about IBM, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, would you talk about it for a second, and then I really do want to talk about kind of what it means to reinvent the supply chain.
Yeah, we have a very strong policy and have for many years on personal data. First of all, we never sell personal data, ever. But when consumers come to our website, we give them the opportunity to opt in or opt out, depending on which geography they're operating in. And the rules are very complicated. I mean, obviously, you've got European rules. We've got CCPA starting in California.
With more coming.
But with lots more coming. But there's also different rules in different countries around the world, right? So IBM operates in 168 or 170 countries. We comply with all the local laws,
And
and our
it's your
systems
brand
have
on
to.
the line, right? Again, I mean, these guys are helping support the kind of ecosystem, but you're on the front lines.
Absolutely. I mean, when people run into a problem, they go back to wherever they think they started.
That's right. That's right. Joe, go ahead, please.
I think that's, it actually bridges the,
I'm going to give this to you because you're not that loud.
it bridges the two here in the sense that, you know, what you're seeing is sort of an elevation of advertising in a much more sort of explicit way, right? Trusted brands, trusted media, where consumers actually know what is going on and, you know, well regulated, and it makes sense. The world, I think, having evolved over 20 years, really is sort of still a messy middle where the definitions are being sort of, you know, defined at the trade association level, for instance, but adoption is up to the company, and a lot of the where it plays out in real life is in the, you know, one-to-one connections between companies that are making commercial connections or technical connections, you know, in real life. And so, you know, what Source is doing is basically saying, let's elevate these connections and agree on principles, you know, LES, that work for the principles, ALS, consumers,
Right, principles
media,
with an LES and principles with an ALS. Yep.
consumers,
Got it.
media owners, and brands,
Yep.
and then of course the plumbers in the room, of which, you know, we're one, make sure the pipes reflect that, make sure the pipes are rebuilt in the right way. The thing I will say, and I just want to ground it to what Michelle was saying yesterday, which was unsolicited, so thank you for making sure that got in there, Rich, was it actually works. Like,
Okay.
if you stop doing dumb things as an industry,
Yeah.
if you start doing logical things as an industry, and you just focus on the long term as opposed to the short term, you're willing to make some disruption to business,
Yep.
you can actually make a huge leap forward in terms of how this industry works. And the fact that, like, this group did it is incredibly motivating. So hopefully people see in this, as opposed to, you know, because I hear it as you know, talk about all the things that we as an industry should do, what other people should do, this bias for action, that there is a path forward for the industry that people can do right now, I think is incredibly important for people to take away, that
All right, then,
we got to move.
Can you explain what, how you, what kind of logical things are you replacing for dumb? And what does we did it look like? Can we talk a little bit about what it actually means in practice? And you kick us off, Joe, but I want all of you are participants, and I want to hear from all of you.
Yeah, so super quick. So basically said, okay, get groups together, put the joint roadmaps into 3 key pillars, right? What does accountability mean? It starts with this commitment to radical transparency, tip to tail, right? And it's just like, okay, if you want to build trust in the supply chain, if you want to build trust with consumers, you actually have to know what's going on. And to Rich's point, like, it wasn't like that. It was hard to get that insight.
I mean, not even close.
Wasn't even close, right? And by the way, not necessarily for bad reasons, right? The fact that, you know, you had a marketplace that wasn't designed, and then you had a bunch of companies that were trying to patch up holes, whether it was in viewability, whether it was in, you know, tracking, right? And it was sort of a natural outgrowth of a building that was built in the 1950s, and then suddenly you need to put Cat5 cable in there, and you decided you want to have a, you know, larger kitchen, and you woke up and you were like, well, how does this house work anymore, right?
yeah.
So the opportunity to bring
Not
it
by
down
design.
bring it down to the studs and rebuild it. Suddenly a bunch of things that were necessary in an inefficient marketplace, suddenly no longer necessary. Natural efficiency.
Can we have it, and just like radical transparency? Well, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Joe made a good point. You have to know what's going on. From an identity perspective, every single media owner, publisher, and enterprise marketer that engages with us on the identity side is saying, I need this so I can understand what IDs I have in a central ID on these individuals. Because if I'm going to manage opt-outs, if I'm going to be privacy compliant, then these disparate data lakes in my organization, the CRM organization that's sending email campaigns and gets a request for an opt-out, this is a huge challenge. So identity resolution, central ID, different levels of identity, first-party cookie, email address, street address, phone number, right? All of that is part of the use case that we're enabling for clients.
I mean, here's the funny thing. The great irony is we have to know you to forget you.
Exactly.
Truly, and that's not
And if
how
I
the-
know you in 5 different places as 5 different IDs, right, in the
Yeah.
new world of first-party identity, what brings it together to manage that opt-out quickly and do
by
it
the way,
in
if
privacy
we don't
safe
really know you, but you want to be forgotten, that's a terrible consumer
Exactly,
experience, right?
yes.
David, can you talk a little bit about, like, what does radical transparency mean for a publisher? And then I'm really curious about what is the responsibility of the brand in this new world? You know, because you're spending dollars, but you have a responsibility here. So start us off on publishers.
I'm going to answer it a little differently
Go
than you
for it.
asked it,
That's
because
fine.
I don't think it's radical transparency to a publisher any differently than it's radical transparency to the companies, to the buyers in this room. When you go buy a complicated item in the real world, let's say you go buy a car, you look on the sticker and you could see the base price of the car, you could see all the options, you could see exactly what it costs. You may care, and it's usually on the sticker where it's manufactured, how much is US, how much is global, whatever it is. And that's a level of transparency that arms you with an element of understanding what that car is valued at. And now we also have these great tools when you go buy a car where you could figure out what the dealer paid from the manufacturer.
Information symmetry.
Yes. And the result of the information symmetry is that the buyer and the seller are playing on a level playing field, and both parties can come out of the transaction feeling like this worked for me. If I'm the buyer, I got the car I want to buy at the price I want to pay, and the dealer says, you know what, I made a fair margin on this car and have a happy customer. And I think that what we lost in programmatic, in all its growth of complexity and additional layers of this, that, and the other thing is the ability for those two principles in the supply chain, the buyer and the seller, to do business that both parties feel really good about. So we said it just a little while ago, Joe said it, like what is the thing that we can do that says this was a win? I think the thing we can do is to have everyone in this room, all the buyers of digital media that use programmatic, the ecosystem, to come back and say the promise, which was the automation was supposed to be efficiency.
I remember.
The promise comes back.
So I was such a naive believer 12 to 15 years ago.
Yeah. And it's the promise is still there.
Yeah.
And the ability for us as buyers and sellers to demand that promise is sort of coming back into the fray. It was like this period of time when it was just okay to put all this stuff into the supply chain and have the mystery and therefore the margin. But what this initiative is all about is saying that's not okay. And we as plumbers, to use Joe's metaphor, although I think I can do some plumbing, very basic plumbing, we as plumbers of the digital programmatic ecosystem have made a commitment here to demystify.
Okay, but to be clear, the reality is that there will be things that drop out because they need to.
They will be, because buyers will have the tools now to be able to rationalize the spend that they put into the ecosystem and say, I'm good with this amount of my media investment going to working media, and I'm good with these elements on the list because they're providing value to me.
Go ahead, and then I do want to ask Rich. Can we ask Rich
Go ahead.
first?
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
that okay?
please.
Go?
Yeah.
So, you know, what is your responsibility then to be kind of a good actor and a responsible participant in this?
Well, clearly
This change.
it comes down to the ethics that you hold as a company.
Yep.
Right? And we've always, IBM has always held our ethics as a very strong point for the company. And we continue to. As we've gone to an online environment, we've taken our customer-centric approach to sales and applied that same set of ethics that we've always lived by into our digital universe. And I think most large companies, at least those that are going to survive, right, have had that sort of ethical approach. The ones who haven't, you see bad things about in the news and they have lots of problems. But we keep focus on that ethical behavior, understanding what our consumers want, not just from a product, but how they want us to interact them as part of the
Interaction
community.
with you as a company, yeah, and each other maybe. Yeah, okay, fair enough. Joe, go ahead.
I was just going to go lofty and then very practical and tactical. So
Go for it.
I think some of the issues really stemmed from predated, programmatic or automation or what have you. It was this idea that in the negotiation between an advertiser and media, it was a zero-sum game, right? And to some extent, all of the technical work that's happened over the last decade has largely sort of facilitated that one underlying fallacy that media and consumers were commodities, right? And I would say what's happened, or what is happening now, is this recognition that like advertisers need good media and good journalism and good publishing and good content to survive, right? And publishers, if there was a trusted relationship between a media owner and an advertiser, and the advertiser knew by sharing more data, by having more insight around KPIs and goals, not at the high level, not at the the reach level, but at the what am I actually trying to accomplish as a business, then both parties could collaborate to drive shared goals.
I mean,
because everyone is in it together.
That's I know you're going to get to the nitty-gritty in a second, and we're out of time. But that's a monster paradigm shift.
It was on
Monster.
stage.
Yeah.
So what we saw in real life was IBM saw better performance as measured by KPIs that translated to actual sales. Publishers saw more money, and Rich was happy to pay more to get more, and publishers were delighted to receive it.
I'm so glad to hear that, because I think we've been preaching that for years.
Absolutely.
But in the television world, it's like, how do we get it cheaper, 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 and that's seen as success,
Yeah.
right? This is a very different way of thinking.
It's all
The
about
questions
yield.
they're coming
There's
back.
questions rolling in.
Yeah, Rich, you get the last word before we get to
I'm
questions,
just saying,
because
Joe was referencing Michelle Peluso's conversation, and it's all about driving the yield. And I'll happily pay twice as much for an ad if I get twice the yield. The equation
where
is
were
not
you
cheaper,
10 years
it's quality.
ago? Can you imagine if we'd built it that way from the beginning?
Absolutely,
Yeah,
it'd be great.
Okay, that's make my little heart sings when I hear that. All right, so we do have some questions, so thank you for sticking with us. I hope this is both thought-provoking and appropriately gritty. There's so much more to talk. I don't know how we solve this stuff in 30 minutes. This is something that I am, personally and professionally as a research analyst, super passionate about, writing a ton about, as are, I think, all of these kind of individual constituencies. So I'm so pleased to be able to have this conversation. Okay, so let's see. Where do I want to start? Maybe we'll start with the login with Google, login with Facebook question. So someone asked, login with Google, login with Facebook. These are becoming more and more abundant in apps, in online publishers, and online services. How are you finding the login function helping marketers or hindering marketers? Key here, through these two data giants. That's what's key here.
Yeah.
Jerry, I know you have an opinion, again, because we talked about publishers and data and so consumer access.
Yeah, I think it's very simple here. Google won't give you the ID, nor will Facebook. It doesn't become your ID, right? So with the login is going to continue in those big walled ecosystems. And obviously, if you look at Ads Data Hub, right?
But in case it's a Google,
we
solution.
we just talked about an open ecosystem. What Adobe and Salesforce are even doing as marketing cloud platforms is saying, bring your own ID graph, right? So I want my basis of identity. I want an organization that we work with that says, I have 20 million customers. I have individuals who visited the site. I want to plug that in, and I want to know the match rate. I want to know when I've reached these individuals. You don't get that back. So I think they're going to continue to have logins. And if you're a publisher, do you want to rent an ID from Facebook for a login that you don't get back to then manage your reach and frequency?
Right, so here's the problem.
Monetization efforts.
Philosophically, I think we probably all can agree. But practically speaking, do we end up in a world where they just continue to sort of eat up the login with? Or do we have some kind of concerted movement
There-
on the part of, say, large publishers.
Concerted movement happening already. I mean, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to jump
David,
in here because
please.
look, Google and Facebook have created enormous convenience for consumers. And we're all users of their apps and their products and their ecosystems as consumers. 10 minutes ago, we said that one of the goals of this initiative was to provide a greater level of transparency and control to the principals in the supply chain.
Including
And-
the consumer.
Including the consumer.
Yeah.
3 principles. And when we abdicate responsibility for identity and for data analysis behind a walled garden that does not provide that level of transparency, we are not progressing the goal of giving everyone the tools to make better choices here and giving everyone in this room and the publishers that either here or back home the ability to exercise the choices of the consumers that they serve. So these are enormous marketplaces for data, and there's a lot of value there. This is not a bash on Google and Facebook. It's simply that we as media buyers and sellers need to make a choice as to whether we want to abdicate that responsibility or own that responsibility. And if we want to own it, if we want to have the choice in our hands and the control in our hands, then simply abdicating into Google and Facebook is not an answer.
So it's a perfect segue to our next question, which is about what the prominent hurdles are to achieving information symmetry. And I mean, really what it comes down to is, does the business requirement of each side line up with the philosophical and ethical thing to do? Which is to say, how do we get the buyers and sellers to share information because it's the right thing to do for all of the reasons we're talking about, but also works for them? So how do we get there? Either, any.
It's a fairly complicated question.
Yeah, it is,
honestly.
exactly.
But
Solve
the
it
short
in 5
version
minutes.
is I always look at it as as conversation about controlling your personal data. You're the consumer. You own yourself. You own your data. I need to be willing to give you, or I'll use the word sell you, information that you're willing to pay for, right, with that personalized information. If I'm consistently giving you a high quality return for that, you're going to keep wanting to share that information. And if I'm not, you should have the opportunity of saying, no, I don't want that anymore, right? And it's really about enabling the choice of the consumer, and that's where the benefit's going to come in for everybody.
Joe, are you having flashbacks? I remember us having this conversation like 10 years ago where you were like, we should just have a campaign as an industry where we educate consumers on the value exchange. And everybody's like, ha ha ha, you're crazy.
I am crazy. I'm usually right. My timing's really bad.
Yeah, your timing's terrible. But this is a really important question right now.
Tying this thing together to that, like how do you actually drive industry-wide change, right? I think you start with, hey, how do you recruit participation, right? Well, do you trust the way it's been built, right? Do you trust, like, is it designed the right way? Do you understand sort of the sort of the value exchange, whether that's true from a consumer perspective, it's certainly true from an advertiser to a publisher perspective, and then sort of everything in between, fine. And then it's like anything else. You have to prove it. You have to validate that the assumptions that led you to make this decision. I'm thinking back to Bob's presentation about which it was effectively like, is the level of effort relative to the expected value of an initiative worth it? Did it pay off, right?
Yep.
And you create this flywheel where you say, look, we're asking people to do this thing. And you very quickly get to the proof point and be like, yep, it's designed the right way, and it turns out it actually works, and then ask for something different, and basically just create that momentum that says, yep, there's an alternative way of doing things. And I will say, the nice part about where we are as an industry is stasis is no longer an option.
Totally.
Status quo ante is no longer like, let's just keep doing what we're doing. And that is massively motivating. It's massively motivating to be like, it's existential from the perspective of a brand to be able to reach a consumer.
Back to urgency and existential.
It's existential for consumers to be able to get like free content and services and to be able to connect to people like jobs, I'm pretty sure. And pretty sure companies have to thrive using marketing in order to employ people, right? And we're at this point now where this is the moment that we're at. And boy, if that's not a call to arms, if that's not a cause to get out of bed and be like, let's go do something bold and driven, I don't know what is. Are folks like Are we into this?
Well, here's the here's the thing. What we're talking about can feel really nerdy and in the weeds, but for this room, like we were talking about the future of a healthy, sustainable advertising ecosystem. I cannot stress enough what a big, fat effing deal this is.
Yeah.
It's a very, very big deal.
Yeah.
And quickly, because I want to get some more questions.
Well,
Go ahead, David.
I'm going to put two questions together
Go
for
for
a
it.
second, because we talked about information symmetry, and then the middle question, or the second one now, is do you feel the transparent supply chain will help grow? So let's just look at the penultimate example in this country of a marketplace that's super, super healthy. It's the stock market. I mean, it's not always going up, as it hasn't been in the last week, but it's
Been a rough week.
it's a healthy marketplace because there's information symmetry. Buyers and sellers know everything about these public companies. They have the information with which to make trade decisions, and the market presents trading prices in real time to everyone who wants to participate. That is a marketplace that itself is very healthy and has grown and has benefited those that participate on both sides of the buy-sell transaction. I think programmatic as a ecosystem has been fundamentally unhealthy for a very long time, and we have all realized, as Joe said, that the status quo is not only not sustainable, it's actually not good for buyers who want a sustainable media environment with which to display their ads. It's not good for the consumer who appreciates the free content. It's not good for the publisher who has to fund that content. So I think those things go together, the information symmetry and the health of this marketplace is actually good for all those involved, and we have an opportunity as a group to make that happen.
Okay, so we're on our last minute, and so I'm going to jump to the question that I think matters the most, which is how can marketers engage and help drive this initiative? Because this all sounds well and good, but habits are strong. It is hard to get people to change, even in the face of urgency. And by the way, I would say, when I say habits too, I also mean things like the habit to want to beat down somebody on price, the habit to want to buy third-party data willy-nilly the way you have before.
The habit to want to buy cheap CPMs no matter where
The
they are.
habits of buying cheap CPMs. So can maybe, Rich, as our marketer representative, what should marketers be doing to affect change toward a more healthy ecosystem?
That is probably a trite answer in a little bit, but
It's okay.
think
You have 10
about
seconds,
think about how you want to be treated in the world, and then act that way, right? How do you want your data used? Buy data that way. How do you not want your data used? Don't do that. How do you want to see ads delivered to you? Think about that and deliver ads that way. Always think about it from the perspective of the person you're selling to, and you'll probably do the right thing.
And probably transacting with, last thought, right? Like it also should apply to partners, right?
Absolutely.
Not a vendor relationship, a partner relationship, and that also can be a paradigm shift, I think, inside of a lot of organizations. This is a terrifying red and black 00, so we have to stop. Thank you so much. Again, I hope it was interesting. I know it can feel a little dry, but it's, for us, exciting to have this conversation. So thank you again. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, well,
It's good when everybody's leaning forward.
thank you.